I will ask if we can stop at 7:45 for Q&A. Does that work? And
Sure.
I'll cue you if needed.
Okay. Krishangi, you want to?
Right.
This is Krishangi River. She's worked with me on the background study. Many of you already know her. She's in charge of a new study that the USGS is doing in the Mojave Desert.
Right, so this is part of the statewide groundwater ambient monitoring and assessment program that we're doing with the State Water Quality Control Board. And so we are going to be starting sampling next week, and I have an outline here of the areas that we're going to be sampling. It starts from Victorville and all the way out to Newberry Springs and the end there. And so we are soliciting volunteers, households that are on domestic water supply. The sampling is based on a grid system, and so wells are going to be selected randomly, but if anybody would like to volunteer in the area, we can take about 4 or 5 people in the Hinkley Valley. Please come talk to me afterwards and I'll give you some information. There are some criteria for what wells that we're able to sample, just as part of the gamma sampling program. We will be sampling for constituents like inorganic ions such as arsenic, chromium, uranium, but we're also doing some other things that aren't really common, like perchlorate. We're also sampling for volatile organic compounds. These are tracers of human activity. We're also looking at pharmaceutical compounds, things like caffeine. And we're also looking at radionuclides. So it's kind of a unique data set. And talk to me afterwards if you're interested, or if you know anybody else in the area that maybe would like to have their well sampled. I have some handouts. That's all. Thank you.
Thanks, Krishangi. Just as a follow-up point, we sampled a number of the domestic wells in Hinkley Valley in 2016, and about 40% of the wells that we sampled had arsenic concentrations greater than the maximum contaminant level of the drinking water level. Some of those concentrations are actually quite high, about 500 parts per billion, which is astronomical in many ways. That's 50 times the drinking water limit. We also, about 7% of the wells in the valley had uranium concentrations above the drinking water limit. So if you're interested, talk to Krishangi. If you're not interested, but you do drink your well water, I would strongly suggest that you have it sampled and analyzed professionally in a lab.
Hey, John, is that a one-time sampling event?
For Krishangi's, yes.
Yeah, so it would be a one-time, although ideally we will come back again in 5 years or so and try and sample some additional wells.
So thank you. It's always a pleasure to be back here and speaking to the group. By way of reintroduction, I work for the U.S. Geological Survey. That's an agency within the federal government, within the Department of Interior. And we have no land management responsibilities, nor do we have any regulatory responsibilities. So my job is solely to provide unbiased scientific data and analysis for federal, state, and local agencies. As part of the Hinkley background study, I'm contracted with the Wahan Regional Water Quality Control Board. It's a 5-year, $5.5 million study. The purpose of that study is to look at natural and anthropogenic or man-made chromium-6 occurrence in the Hinkley and Water Valley areas. The study initially began in 3 years ago, in January 2015. And right now, I'm not going to talk so much about results that we have, but I'm going to talk about the nuts and the bolts of the work that we've done and what we've accomplished in 3 years, and tell you a little bit about the work that I need to do in the remaining year and a half before my draft report is due, and 2 years before the final report is due. Everybody in this room would be familiar with this slide, the information here. You know where you're at. You're about 80 miles northeast of Los Angeles, and this is Hinkley, and Water Valley's here. This would be Harper Dry Lake and the Mojave River there. The PG&E compressor station is located about there. And Chrome 6 from the compressor station was released between about 1952 and 1964, so that's a number of years ago. In 2007, PG&E did a background study, and on the basis of that study, they estimated a background Chrome 6 concentration of 3.1 micrograms per liter. This shows the maximum extent of mapped 3.1 chromium-6 concentrations in Hinkley and Water Valley. PG&E acknowledges this area here, which is about 4 miles in extent, compared to about 10 or 12 miles extent. So you can see there's extreme uncertainty in the extent of Chrome-6 occurrence in the valley, and how much of that occurrence is natural, and how much of that occurrence may be PG&E's responsibility. And therefore, what needs to be regulated on by the Regional Water Quality Control Board, and what management actions are appropriate to protect the health and safety of the community. The USGS began their background study 3 years ago in January 2015. I've actually been out here for about 5 years, working with the community, developing the study, and getting things going. This slide is, in fact, 5 years old. That was prepared, one of the first things we did when we were talking about the background study, and this is dates from 2013. And I'm showing it just to make the point that we haven't changed our goals and we haven't changed our objectives. The purpose of the study is just to evaluate very straightforwardly and very simply the occurrence of natural and anthropogenic or man-made chromium in the valley, estimate background concentrations up gradient near the plume margins and down gradient from the map plume near Hinkley, California. That component of the study differs from the previous study in that it is outlined within the proposal as a goal and something that we're doing, and it recognizes, first off, that we're going to have to define the plume margin for the purposes of the study, and that we're going to have to look at different areas in the valley and that they may be different. That recognition was new at the time in 2013 when we first started talking with people in the community. There are some other things that will come out of this study. The occurrence of other trace elements in the valley, I already mentioned, arsenic and uranium issues. And with working with the community, with Project Navigator, the Lahontan Regional Water Quality Control Board, we have an opportunity to, as we do work in the valley, learn things and understand things that could help the community and help the valley with other water resource issues. I've said this before, but it's worth saying again at this point in time. The study, although it's very complex and very detailed, was really one of the easiest proposals I ever had to write in my entire career. And that's because all I had to do was listen to the stakeholders. Listen to the needs of the Lahontan Board, listen to the needs of PG&E, and most importantly, listen to the needs of people in the community, many of which were very involved and very well informed and articulate in terms of what they thought needed to be done. All I had to do was just come up with a data collection and study plan to address those needs and issues. And what I'm going to talk about here is the work that we've done over the past 3 years to move towards addressing those issues. This is a simplified timeline for the study. Again, work began in January 2015. We actually got out in the field for our first sampling round in March of 2015. So within really about 6 weeks, we were able to mobilize and get out here. We did 3 sampling rounds as part of the study. Task 3, March 2015. Task 3, March 2016. Task 3, again, March 2017. And in total, for wells that we have collected and analyzed samples for what we refer to as our complete suite, not just chromium-6, not just trace elements, but a variety of environmental tracers that we work with as part of the study in order to help us understand hydrologic processes and the occurrence of Chrome-6. And working with the community, we sample these iteratively. First sample round, we pick about 40 wells, going back and forth with the community and getting their input. There's nobody that knows this area better than the local people who live out here, and that was very, very valuable. We use that input to guide our next sampling round, and that input again to guide our final sampling round. So the community and the various stakeholders had a lot of advice to share with us and help us get that going and make those decisions. So really there's a lot of ownership of this study from you all folks in the room here. Talk about task 3. Task 1 is not on here, and that was really a review of existing data that's been collected by PG&E that was concerned about the quality of that data and what it meant in terms of the study. It's a huge database. They have over 700 monitoring wells in the valley. They've sampled over 500 domestic wells. They have a total of more than 20,000 Chrome-6 analyses dating back to, I don't know, probably the early 1990s or so. It's a tremendous database. I've had the opportunity to look at that database and evaluate it. I promise people in the room that you won't have to just take my word for things, and when we put together the final report, I'll actually have numbers on the quality of that data But at this point in time, I would say it's not only industry standard, but it's very high quality data. It's very, very useful for the purposes that it needs to be, and they've done a very good job in terms of what they need to do there. Task 2 is, I'm a geologist, so I tend to look at geology, mineralogic data. It's not on the slide here, but I'll be showing you some results about that. Where's the chromium coming from? If it's natural, is it in the rock? How does it get here? Task 4, I'm a hydrologist, so I need to understand how water flows through the system, how it moved in the past, and how it moves today. We use those data to help support the groundwater flow model that's being updated as part of PG&E's work to support the background study. Part of those updates are dependent upon the USGS regional groundwater flow model that was originally constructed in 2001. That model goes back to pre-development, back into the 1930s, so that we can look at issues related to water movement and contaminant transport in early time when the chromium was first released into the valley, part of the goals of the study. Task 6 and Task 7 are actually the details related to how we will estimate background, and I'll go through that for you. They are spelled out in what we've been referring to as the midterm report. We submitted that to the Lahontan Regional Board in December for purposes of meeting our contract, but we sent that out to USGS review to make sure that we got the highest quality input from experts in other places in the country. I've got those review comments back. I'll be working on that. As soon as I'm finished with that, we'll post that online. That will be available to the community. Everything that we have done is open. We've tried to keep open meetings, open input to everybody there. That report has links to the data. It has links to the contracts. It has links to the quarterly summaries. So if anybody has any questions about how the study developed, how it moved forward, they should be answered in that report. Task 8 was designed especially at the request of people in the community, and I'll talk a little bit about how those experiments are progressing as part of this presentation. Oh, just one more thing. I just want to make a point to everybody that we are on track to complete the work on time. Things are moving as scheduled, and we're also on budget. Believe me, I worry about that all the time, but we're meeting our goals, and I anticipate further that everything I said that I could do in the original proposal, that I will be able to accomplish with the data that we've collected so far. One thing that was not specifically mentioned in that timeline is geologic issues within the valley. And at the request of the technical working group, Dave Miller, who was a participant in the study, we sort of beefed up his role in the study, and he looked at the geologic history of the valley, and he looked at the depositional history of the valley. He examined core materials from about 150 wells that were archived by PG&E. Chris Maxwell, one of PG&E's consultants, says they have about 6 miles worth of core material in the core shed that they stored there. I would say Dave probably looked at somewhere between 1 mile and 2 miles of that in great detail. He describes it in terms of depositional provenance, in terms of how that material was deposited and where that was deposited. This is just a simplified geologic history of the valley that he's come up with. If you lived here between 1.5 million years ago and about 300,000 years ago, you could have had lakefront property in Hinkley. We know these dates and these time constraints from volcanic ashes that are buried within the valley that we can date. Many of those ashes originate from volcanic eruptions in Yellowstone that occurred more than 700,000 years ago. But the Mojave River first reached the valley somewhere about 1 million or so years ago into Harper Lake, spilled over in this gap here where the present-day Highway 58 runs through. About 300,000 years ago, it breached a new gap at the southern end of Iron Mountain and entered the valley in a series of very large fan complexes here that are highly permeable. And present day, it's filled up the valley. About 100,000 years ago, it breached the gap at Barstow. And during that period of time, until recent days, it could flow either way, towards Barstow and the Pleistocene Lake Mannix, or towards Harper Lake up here towards the north. And we have evidence from looking at the core material of a continual, through-flowing Mojave River as recently as probably 10,000 years ago, or maybe even more recent than that. And that has important implications that helps us understand spatial variations of hydraulic properties within the aquifer, helps us understand how groundwater moves and how contaminants would move with that groundwater. And it helps us understand the origin of the groundwater materials there, of the aquifer materials, and the chemistry of those materials with respect to chromium. Before we even started the work, we knew that Hinkley was in an area that was geologically low in chromium. Chromium concentrations in much of the valley, in the aquifer material, are pretty low. I would throw out to people, based on our measurements, a number of about 5 to 7 milligrams per kilogram. That's parts per million in the solids. The continental average for chromium is about 180 milligrams per kilogram. Mafic rock up here in the San Gabriels, which does actually contribute in the geologic past to Hinkley, has concentrations about 8 to 9,000 milligrams per kilogram chromium. So there are wide ranges in the environment. And we collected about 1,600 measurements, largely Tershongi's work, on rock, alluvium, and core materials throughout the valley. We're working on releasing this material as a data release that will be online for everybody to examine and look at. We examined these materials with handheld X-ray fluorescence, collected data on 27 elements. And this here map that you see here just shows the locations of the materials that we sampled. The rocks are triangles, the alluvium samples are sort of the diamonds, and core materials in the center here are wells, and the geologic materials that you see on that map are here. And although concentrations in Hinkley Valley are not nearly as high as what they might be in the San Gabriel Mountains, we do have high concentrations in parts of Iron Mountain, where we have some intrusive mafic type rocks, gabbros, hornblende diorites, materials like that. You see some of those over here in Mount General, but given their location, most of that material goes this way. Iron Mountain for local alluvium can be locally important. Also, the volcanics up here, Black Mountain, the basalts, they're about near the continental average. And you can just see some pictures of materials that we've actually measured within the valley, so we do have a good understanding locally where things are coming from, but much of the material, most of the material, in fact, in the valley that's used for water supply is from the Mojave River. And so these are locally important, but most of the stuff is actually pretty low, and it varies with texture and things like that. Task 3, we sampled about 106 wells for complete chemical and isotopic data. This is a map showing the locations of those wells scattered throughout the valley. Many of them were monitoring wells that were installed by PG&E that were not available in the 2007 background study. So that's a major improvement on our study compared to the original study, is that we have monitoring wells that are designed, they have high quality lithologic and geologic data and screen construction information for us to evaluate. We did sample some domestic wells on outlying positions, and we had some wells drilled as part of the study. And we looked very specifically at changes in chemistry with depth within the core of the plume from some production wells with some depth-dependent sample techniques that we have. And again, this was an iterative process shared with the community. During the first year, we sampled about 40 of these wells. We used that data that were selected with input from the community to then guide the selection of the next round of wells. We collected about 30 wells. And we used the data from the first 2 rounds, again with input from local stakeholders, to collect data from the last wells. I made certain, as part of this, that we sampled many of those wells multiple times. And the reason is that we know that things are changing within the valley, largely because of PG&E's management activities. And information on the changes that are occurring are sometimes much more valuable to us than actually an individual sample. So we have a lot of data, carefully selected data, and carefully collected through time. Of course, the most important thing that we analyze for is chrome-6, and this just shows you a map of chrome-6 concentrations within Hinkley Valley from those 100 or so wells that we sampled. And I do want to make the point that we filter our samples. Our study is a physical study of the plume extent and its movement within the groundwater system. It's not a public health study. And I recognize that many of the people in the community see the difference, and rightfully so, between water samples that we collect that are filtered and water samples that come out of their tap. Our samples are instructive for public health purposes, but again, if you're concerned about the water from your well and your tap and your infrastructure at your house, I strongly suggest that you analyze that and take responsibility for the water that you drink, because it's very, very important. Because we sampled primarily from monitoring wells that we had a lot of information from, there was bias inherent in the study in terms of the footprint of those monitoring wells. We didn't want that to define the footprint of our knowledge and the footprint of the answer that we were going to get. So we sampled in January 2016 an additional 72 domestic wells scattered throughout the valley in a large number of different locations. And for those of you who let us sample your well, thank you very much. It was extraordinarily valuable and useful information. It's contributed greatly to the study. And there you can see just a map of what that data looked like. Again, a lot of low concentrations between less than 1 and 1 to 2. In the eastern and western parts of the valley, within the core of the plume, we have our higher concentrations. And as you move up to the north, we have a mix of low and high concentrations. And those are part of the issues that we tend to resolve. If you were here in January 2016, you got to meet Blaine McCleskey. He's with the USGS in Denver, Colorado. He actually brought out his mobile lab. These are the same instruments that one would use to analyze Chrome 6 within a commercial laboratory. Many of you actually followed your samples back with us. We would collect the sample, we would bring them back to the lab, and he would analyze them within 20 minutes. So you actually be able to follow that bottle when it came out of your tap, the water came out of your tap, to when Blaine did the analysis, so you could see everything that was happening, how those samples are handled, how they're processed, the care that goes into collecting a sample. Because our detection limits and PG&E detection limits are very, very low. These things have to be handled very, very carefully, very expertly, in order to get those very, very low concentrations that we need as part of this study. In addition to chromium and other trace elements and constituents that you're familiar with, we analyze for a lot of what we refer to as environmental tracers. Collectively, those tracers help us identify the source of the water. I can tell you that virtually all the water in Hinkley Valley is sourced from infiltration of stream flow in the Mojave River, which occurs only intermittently. Obviously, we're probably not going to get any this year. We missed last year, which was unfortunate. We can trace geologic materials using a particular set of isotopes. We can look at contaminant source with chromium isotopes directly. And rather than fingerprinting the source, we're really looking at the processes and how that chromium changes from natural sources and from man-made or release sources as it moves through the aquifer. We also have tools to look at water age. Carbon-13, carbon-14, if you were an archaeologist or if you like that sort of information, you know that people do that to date very old things. It works for water also. Some of the water in the valley is very, very old. Presumably, water that was not sourced from the Mojave River and is very, very old, predating the contaminant releases, should not contain chromium associated with PG&E's releases. Younger waters can be dated with tritium, which is a radioactive isotope. It occurs naturally, but it was released in very, very large quantities into the atmosphere during the atmospheric testing of nuclear weapons, beginning in about 1952, about the same time frame as the chromium release, and continuing to about 1962. We can refine that number with its daughter product, helium-3. Helium-4, which is exuded from the core of the Earth, we measure that also, and we use that to date waters. Industrial gases, chlorofluorocarbons, sulfur hexafluoride. For those of you who remember, back in 1998, the use of chlorofluorocarbons was banned because they deplete ozone in the atmosphere and the Montreal Protocol. So they have a different time history than tritium and carbon-14. And so they give us different information in terms of how we can look at the system. And this here is just a summary of the tritium data that we have collected. Those data are all back. These were analyzed by laboratories in Germany. It's probably the only laboratory in the world that at the time could get numbers as low as what they get. 0.02 tritium units, which is an order of magnitude lower than most conventional labs. So we went to the best possible sources to get the best possible data for this study. Whoops, back up just a little bit. And the release, the entry of tritium into the atmosphere is controlled by stream flow in the Mojave River. And you see during much of this period of time, the river didn't flow. 1969 is a big event, 1993, 2005, maybe a little bit in the 70s, so that we don't have a continual input, we only have intermittent inputs. That actually helps us understand the data and interpret these. We're going to be spending the better part of the next year working very carefully with these data and the other environmental tracer data to understand the age distribution and how water got into the aquifers and which waters have the right time history and the right source that they might contain chromium released by the compressor station, and which waters could not possibly contain water chromium released from the compressor station. Tasks 4 and 5, looking at the groundwater flow model and the development of that model. And we need data, we need information to support the development of that model. The community was very clear that they wanted to have information about what happened in early time. What was the valley like in 1952? They were quite correct. And they were saying the conditions there were different than what they are now. So we went all the way back to early USGS reports, date back to the early 1900s to construct pre-development water level map. How groundwater moved and flowed within the system. I'll show a little bit more about that. We pay very close attention to water budgets. Just as you manage your household, your business, and you watch the flow of money in and out, the aquifer is very much the same way. We watch the flow of water in and out of the aquifer. Those are things that we measure. Those are things that we know. And those are control points for us to help us make sure that we have the best possible model developed. And some of those numbers come from the USGS groundwater flow model. Some come from things that we measure and have measured as part of the study. Aquifer properties, we've looked at alluvial thickness, making very, very precise measures of gravity. We've looked at hydraulic properties using slug test data. We've collected almost 100 of those where we actually pressurize a well and measure how quickly it responds. We've looked at layering of aquifer properties using a variety of geophysical techniques in probably almost 100 wells, and some depth-dependent data with numerical analysis of about 5 or 6 wells. Some of that work is very, very expensive to do. We've looked at the hydraulic properties of the alluvium that was formerly saturated. Back underneath the compressor station, at pre-development, water levels were about 20 feet below land surface. Present day, they're about 87 feet below land surface. The question is, what are the properties of the materials and how fast could it conduct water and how fast could it conduct chromium back in 1952 when that contaminant was first released? We can't measure that directly, but we do have methods of getting numbers and estimating those values. Hydraulic properties of the Lockhart Fault that runs through the valley in this area here has a great control of how water moves through the system. We spent a lot of time working on that, and we're feeling that we're beginning to get an understanding of how water flows or doesn't flow around and through that fault. This is a pre-development water level map. It's worth just taking a look at because you live there. This is about 1930. The blue colors represent areas where the water stood at or near or perhaps above land surface. Down here on this side of South Mountain, you can see water levels near land surface. Back in the old days, there were stands and groves of trees there. Same thing with over here in Barstow. Railroad comes through here. Many of you are aware that the old Santa Fe Railroad used to have the wells in the 1900s over in this area. The reason they were there and the community of Hinkley began to exist, the depths of water at that location were 14 feet below land surface. Now they're about 80 feet below land surface. The dairies in this area and the dairies up in here, further up, they have pre-1912 water rights because they were pumping from areas where the water levels were 10 to 15 feet below land surface, and they could be pumped with in the early technologies that were available in the 1900s. Water Valley, the reason they call it Water Valley was because if you drilled a shallow well in that area, it would flow under its own pressure. That big blue area here, when you go back and you look at the reports, they describe bradphytes, grasses, wetland areas, miles in extent in this area. Huge quantities of water being discharged in this area that originated as infiltration from the Mojave River. And it's very important for us to understand that, what happened back in early times, and how that affects the system and what sort of hydraulic properties you have to have in order to move water through the system in that fashion. We have a very complex data set with a lot of things that we've looked at, and there was a lot of concern on everybody's part that different pieces of this would be looked at differently by the various stakeholders, and that would all come to different conclusions based on different pieces of information. So I had to come up with a method to look at it collectively as a whole. And what we have is a summative scale. And we have a series of questions. There are about 10 of them that we're working with that are described in the midterm report. I've listed 5 of them here. For every well that we've sampled, we have sufficient data to answer these questions. And so for every well that we sample, for each of the 10 questions, we can create a score. That score will be positive values of 1 if it's consistent with release from the compressor station. And that doesn't mean it was released from the compressor station. For example, if it's a young water, does the groundwater contain some fraction of water, recent water? It could be consistent with release from the compressor station. It could get a 1. If it's very, very old water, it would score to -1. Geologic materials at the well screen, we've measured that. Do they contain more or less chromium than the abundance, continental abundance? Is it high value or is it low value? If it's a high value, you might think about the chromium in the water that's sampled from that well a little bit differently than you would if it's a low value. So if it's a high value, we might score to -1. If it's a low value, we might score to 1. Was the water recharged from the Mojave River? Water from the Mojave River passed into the compressor station. Not all water from the Mojave River did, but some of it did. So if it's Mojave River water, it might get scored a +1, but if it's not Mojave River water, there's no way it could be associated with movement under the compressor station and direct contamination from the plume, so we would score it a -1. The idea is that we will look at all the wells, all the data collectively in this fashion before we begin to make interpretations. We'll sum those scores. And so it will give us a first cut interpretation of what the plume margin looks like, what could be associated with the PG&E's releases, and what is likely to be natural. And there's a reason that we're doing it this way. And it's very thought out, and it's been talked extensively with the technical working group. Number one, it's transparent. You're not relying on me to go back into my office for the next year and a half and work quietly and by myself without sharing any information with the community. Everything I do, you can look at. And you can agree or disagree with it, but most importantly, you can participate in that process. It's unbiased and it's traceable. Every decision that's made on every well from every measurement has to be supported by a numerical measurement and data. You don't have my interpretation, as it were. I think it's going to be this or I think it's going to be that. It's a number. It forces the data to be considered collectively. That was a very big concern at the beginning of the study, in that perhaps certain pieces of data would come out and decisions would be made prematurely on the extent of the plume or the extent of natural chromium within the system, and we would jump early on to an incorrect decision. This forces us to wait and look at everything that we've got together, because some labs take a long time to complete the analysis. I'm still waiting for some of those data back. And some things get done very, very quickly. It's also flexible. As we learn more about the system, we can modify the scale. We can look at things a little bit differently. We can change things as needed as we get some consensus going on within the group as we're looking at the data. But most importantly, we can evaluate whether we have good scale or bad scale. If we have a successful scale, it'll correctly identify areas where there is agreement. There are high numbers within the plume, the mapped plume that PG&E agrees belong to them. We should be able to score those using this approach as anthropogenic. There are areas within the valley, I just described one, very, very old groundwater, deep wells that are not sourced from the Mojave River, that independent of their chromium-6 concentration, it would be very, very difficult to argue that that's PG&E's responsibility. So there is some natural chromium, perhaps, in the system. And this is, if we're doing our job right, if we've got a successful scale, and we put it together properly and thoughtfully, we'll identify those areas correctly. And there should be agreement within the stakeholders, at least on some of these end members. We go through this process, and we have an idea, at least a first initial cut of what we think is natural, what we think is PG&E's, what we think is a plume extent. And then we have all the data that we've collected as part of Task 4 that I just went through that supports the groundwater flow model. On one side, we have geologic data. We have hydrologic and geochemical data. On the other side, we have hydraulic data. It's the same study area. It's the same problem. Both approaches should produce the same result, or approximately the same result. So we'll compare and contrast the results that we get from the model and some of the techniques that we do there with the summative scale questions. If they agree, that's pretty good. Where they disagree, that gives us an opportunity to go back, look thoughtfully at our data, look thoughtfully at our model, look thoughtfully at our chemical data. Do they really mean what they think they're telling us, or are we not interpreting them properly? And go back and think about it very, very carefully. Ultimately, we'll come up with a map plume extent. We will use that map plume extent to identify areas outside that map plume, and that's how we'll calculate background chrome 6 concentrations within the area. And that's been outlined in the midterm report. And we'll be working with a subset of wells. We'll focus primarily on wells that we've sampled as part of the USGS background study, because those are the wells that we have the most information on and we know the most about. So it makes sense to focus on those, but we won't neglect the other data. We'll look at it all. We'll have a base period for the calculations that we actually do. And that base period began in April 2017. That's Q2 2017, after the collection of the last round of samples for Task 3. And it runs through March 2018. Actually, it ended in effect for us in January, about a week ago, as we collected our last samples for Task 7. And we got those off to the lab and we're waiting back the analyses. So very soon we'll have a complete set of data available to make those calculations on as soon as we go through the process outlined in Task 6 and have the model data available to put together that plume extent. The background calculations will be representative of chrome 6 concentrations really in Mojave-type deposits, and we recognize that that includes both river alluvium, nearshore and shallow lake deposits. But chromium 6 concentrations in the other geologic materials will be estimated separately. I showed that map where we've had wells that actually penetrated materials that look like weathered bedrock. That's not Mojave-type materials, that's something different. We'll give you a separate number for that to help you understand the variation in geology. And actually, we're going to look at different parts of Hinkley and Water Valleys differently. So it's almost certain that the study will produce different numbers for the east, a different number for the west, and a different number for Water Valley, depending upon where you happen to be in that location. So there will be some inherent variability in the number that is a product of the geology and just the way the system works. This will allow us then to compare and contrast data. Just because there's a method here doesn't mean we can do it unthinkingly. It'll be my responsibility at the end to take the numbers that we come up with and compare them with the domestic wells in the valley. How do they compare? Are they similar? Are they different? Are they truly representative of what we're seeing out there? It'll be my responsibility to take those numbers and compare them with the other PG&E data from wells that we didn't look at. Do they make sense? Are they consistent? Do they form a mappable unit within the valley, or are we looking at hotspots in various locations that we can't explain? In the end, I'll come up with a series of numbers for different parts of the valley, but although there will be background numbers for the USGS study purposes, it's the Lahontan Regional Water Quality Control Board that has the final authority to set background concentrations for regulatory purposes and for plume management purposes. So they will take my data and begin to work with it. Task 8 is a part of the study that where we look at the potential for reoxidation, potential conversion of chrome 3 to chrome 6 in the in-situ reduction zones after in-situ reduction stops. Those experiments are ongoing. They took a year to design. They didn't start until early 2016. They've been divided into two groups. One is we call the sequestration experiments, where we look at how chromium is held within those materials. Chromium is initially reduced to chrome 3. Does it get incorporated into the more refractive minerals on the surfaces of the other mineral grains? or does it stay readily exchangeable? We've looked at that. We've got one more sample set to analyze 2 years into the program before those experiments are completed. The other experiments are reoxidation experiments. We take material, we hold it for over a year, then we expose it to oxygen, and we look at, is the chrome-3 that was reduced in those environments oxidizable to chrome-6 in the presence of oxygen? And initially, I didn't think that we could do it with our wet chemistry techniques that we had available. And these experiments are being done in Menlo Park, and Riddell and Leal and the other folks involved in the TWG have come up, and they've seen the group that is working on those. They've seen the experiments and the microcosms that we work with. I didn't have any faith in the ability of the wet chemistry techniques that we were using to make those measurements. And so this is a Stanford accelerator. It's capable of measuring oxidation states of chromium on the solid phase without extraction. We've got time on the accelerator. It's competitive. You don't pay for it. If your proposal is good enough, you get time on that. We're accepted for 40 shifts of beam time, which is a large amount of beam time. I was very pleased. Our proposal was scored at 1.3. They're ranked from highest being 1, 5 being the lowest. That's a very, very high score. We were extraordinarily lucky and had an extraordinarily well thought out proposal from the people we were working with to get this amount of time on that instrument. As it turns out, this is less effective for looking at chrome-6 in our wet chemistry techniques, but it's being invaluable for looking at how the chrome is held in conjunction with iron on the surface coatings and how it reoxidizes in the presence of manganese. The manganese is the key. It converts chrome-3 to chrome-6 in an oxic environment. Just to illustrate that we're doing our best to give you the best, highest quality science that we can to this project. In summary, we're entering the 4th year of a 5-year study. I have about a year and a half or so, a little bit more than a year, to provide a draft report for the stakeholders to look at and to get me back comments. I'll be very busy. I've got a lot of data to interpret, a lot of things to write. I'm not quite out of the woods yet as far as staying on time and on budget. I've got a lot of work to do. The study uses a range of different geologic, geochemical, and physical techniques to estimate the plume extent and calculate the background chrome-6 concentrations in the area. And the estimate of background chrome-6 concentrations is for regulatory purposes, but the regulatory background values will actually be set by the Lahontan Regional Water Quality Control Board. In many ways, I have the easy job. You guys will have a lot to deal with in a year and a half when the final report comes out. It's an open process. When the midterm report comes out and you get a chance to read it, it'll be posted online. It provides links to the contract. It provides links to data. It provides links to everything that's been produced in the project so far so that you can look at it and you can see. And you're invited to participate. Roger comes to the TWG meetings. Betty's come there in the past. Darren has come. A number of people in the community. Larry has been there. A lot of the decisions and a lot of the discussion in terms of wells to sample is behind us now. We've moved back there. But there's still a lot of things to think about as part of the process, and you're more than welcome to participate. So thank you very much. If you've got any questions, I'm happy to address them. Yes, Betty?
How do you monitor what is coming out of the sky?
We don't. In terms of recharge from infalling precipitation, we actually have made some measurements. This is a desert area, and aerially, the rain that falls on the ground does not directly infiltrate to the groundwater table. It's virtually all taken by the creosote and evaporation. We have measured that in Hinkley Valley using chloride. The chloride pulses that we see in the subsurface beneath undisturbed areas represent about 15,000 years worth of accumulation from precipitation. There is recharge that occurs not just from the Mojave River, but small amounts that occur from small streams that drains from the areas. We've provided non-zero estimates of that for use in the model. We don't monitor chromium contributions from the sky or dust as part of this study because they're not important or significant to us.
I'm just talking about when you look up at the sky and you see the military going over and there's 3 planes and they drop something and there's 3 things hit and then all of a sudden there's all kinds of stuff coming out of the sky and landing all over the Hinkley Valley. I don't know what it's called. I don't know what it is. I understood it was to some sort of a weather project to encourage weather or waterfall, rainfall, in certain parts of the area, which is taking away from other parts of the area. But I don't know how that works, and
We do see the effect of wind blow and dust on chromium concentrations in the shallow materials, and we have measured that. And aeolian would be the word that a geologist would apply to that. But because the water doesn't move through the subsurface, except under irrigated areas, the chromium would not move with it. The irrigated areas where PG&E is doing treatment of the plume, they monitor that, and that's outside the scope of my work. Any other questions?
I do, John. This is in regard to your comment about the irrigated areas and the recharge. What value would you estimate that would be returned to groundwater in terms of percentage from the water that's applied to a field for irrigation?
That's a real important question for the model, and they have different numbers in there depending upon the time. I believe early on they have about a 30% return factor for the water. Later, with more efficient irrigation practices that have been employed in the valley since adjudication, and I think the PG&E facilities are extremely efficient or more efficient, I believe they use about 20% return in the model.
And just a follow-up to that, because you've been doing a very thorough job to try to go back and look at the involvement geologically over time, but now looking from when irrigation started here, probably in the late 30s, I said, the land area that was used to irrigate and the techniques used, as you mentioned, they became more efficient in irrigation over time, but at the same token, there's probably less of an area. Does the model, how do you take into account the amount of recharge on an annual basis or as time changes?
The model is designed to do that. The model has inputs of recharge from the river, inputs of recharge, local focus sources. It, like a checkbook, accounts for water drawn out from storage, water from water pumped and then applied back onto the system. In terms of chromium and contaminant movement, what we will do with the model when we have it working and we're in agreement that it is calibrated and as functional as any model can be, a model is a model and not reality, we'll do what is called particle tracking. And we will do a number of different tracks. One will look at the movement of recharge water from the river and how far it could have gone from the valley. Where we've done that conceptually, what we see is that the layering and heterogeneity of the valley and the pulsed nature of recharge within the valley is very important in the movement of that water. So the model will have to duplicate that with the particles. In addition to looking at recharge, we will look directly at the location of the contaminant release at the compressor station, apply particles there and see how they move. The other concern, it's a very real concern, and I want to give people in the valley credit for being astute enough to insist upon this, is big irrigation wells within the valley will draw water to them. And we'll use a technique called reverse particle tracking to look and see how water may have moved to those wells. It sounds very elaborate. It's really, in the model, it's just flipping a toggle switch from a 1 to a -1 and things run in reverse. So numerically it's very easy to do, but in terms of interpreting the data, it's very, very important to us to do it that way. And so, to get your questions?
Yes.
Okay. Yes.
What model are you using?
It's mod flow. Let me take that back. The coding is actually being done, but the question was what model are we using? And the coding is actually being done by Jacobs, formerly CH2M Hill, and they are using Surfac. which is has a mod flow engine surrounded by a commercially available GUI, graphical user interface, and input functions to the model. We have discussed that use, and they have agreed that they will convert that model to an open source mod flow code when they have it completed. That's what we in the USGS will evaluate. Now, our responsibilities in terms of evaluating that will basically consist of turning it on, literally kicking over the engine as one would in a car, making sure that it runs to completion and closure, and making sure that the water budgets are appropriate and what they're said to be. We won't redo their work, and we won't do any new work with the tool itself. Yes, Larry?
What's the numbers for the present, for the ethanol that we're injecting now, and the numbers for the arsenic and manganese for the byproduct?
Well, in terms of the IRZ, that's not really a question I can answer. Betsy, are you familiar enough with the IRZ process that you can answer that question?
I don't know how much ethanol we're injecting. It's in our reports that we submit quarterly, thanks to the water board. Lisa and Ann know it off the top of their head. And in our annual effectiveness report, we're going to talk about, that's due in February for the water board, how much we injected relative to the plan, which we track monthly. So I'm sorry, I don't know the exact number, but it's close to the plan that we wrote in our annual effectiveness report due February of 2017 last year. We track relative to the plan.
Much of the arsenic that's in the valley is naturally occurring. Regionally, the Mojave Desert is high in arsenic. The average continental abundance of arsenic is about 0.08 milligrams per kilogram. The Mojave River itself is somewhere between 2 and 3, maybe 4 perhaps milligrams per kilogram. Some of the rocks that Krishangi measured on Mount General over there are as high as 1,500 milligrams per kilogram. That would be more than 3 orders of magnitude, almost 2,000 times what the average continental abundance is. So this area is naturally rich in arsenic, and there are certain hydrologic and geologic processes that we've looked at in the study that help us understand where that's coming from. Hopefully we'll be able to address that as part of this study, or at least with some allied studies that we're doing. We'll have a much greater understanding of those processes and why you see those in some of your wells and where you might expect to find
So
them.
this area around here wasn't really that high in arsenic. From all the information I got like a long time ago from Mojave, over there in Victorville, they didn't say that.
That's exactly right. As water levels declined as a result of agriculture, the very productive, coarse-grained Mojave sediments contain recently recharged water that was flowing through the system with very little contact with aquifer materials has been pumped out for agriculture. What remains is now 80 feet below land surface. It's been held in finer grained deposits. There's a big association between the lake deposits that I mentioned way early on in the talk, which are reduced, and the occurrence and recycling of arsenic within the system. And so you're exactly right that in the past that arsenic wasn't there. It was there, but it wasn't being pumped by wells. It would maybe be a more appropriate way to say that.
Well, I didn't have a problem at the property until they started dumping all that ethanol, and then that's when I got the large amounts of arsenic and manganese in the well. But nobody seems to care, and it's been over the MCL for a long, ever since I first tested.
Yeah, I've sampled your well.
You used to have a little bit, but nobody cares about it anyway. I mean, I complained to the water board, complained to Kevin, of course that was like talking to a wall. Well, you were at a couple of some of the meetings where I had run into Kevin, and that went nowhere. Because they were gonna be talking to PG because it was nowhere anyway.
Any other questions? Well, thank you. We're right on schedule.
Well done, thank you.
Thank you.